Ruby Bennett signed her name 3 days earlier on a marriage license application she had not been permitted to read in full. And by the fourth morning, she woke in her late father's London townhouse as though she had been moved into a museum where every object belonged to someone else. The curtains in her chamber had been changed from pale muslin to heavier damask. The writing desk had been turned to face the corridor rather than the window. Even the key to her jewel cabinet, once kept in the small porcelain bowl beside her mirror, was gone. At breakfast, the silver covers lifted in silence, and her mother sat opposite her in dove-grey silk with a ledger open beside the marmalade, as if account balancing and appetite were members of the same household ritual. Mrs. Lenora Bennett did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Her control moved through rooms with the same frictionless certainty as polished wheels on marble. "You will marry where the capital is safest," she said, turning one page with a gloved finger. "Your father left sentiment in his will and uncertainty in his books. We shall correct both." Ruby buttered her toast and did not look down at her hands. She had learned that visible trembling invited inspection. The application was filed under pressure. It was filed under prudence. By your definition. By the trustee's definition, Miss Bennett. We are not conducting philosophy. Lenora returned to her ledger. The conversation ended not because it had reached a conclusion, but because Ruby's consent was considered decorative. What Ruby did not know, what no one at that breakfast table would have admitted if they did know, was that her mother had already sent out inquiries to 2 titled families and 1 banking household before the ink on Ruby's signature had dried. The marriage license was not a promise to one man. It was a net cast over several. By noon, the shape of her confinement had announced itself in a dozen practical humiliations. A footman brought her correspondence on a tray, each envelope slit open with clinical precision. Her aunt in Bath wrote of weak tea and stronger gossip. The page arrived with 2 lines underlined in blue pencil by someone else. A letter from the parish infirmary requesting renewal of her winter subscription bore a small notation in Lenora's hand at the top. "Deferred pending review." Ruby took up her own pen to answer, then stopped when the butler remained at her shoulder, neither leaving nor pretending to busy himself with the sideboard. "Must I dictate?" she asked. "If you wish immediate dispatch, miss," he said, eyes lowered. "Mrs. Bennett instructed that all outgoing post be checked for legal implications." Legal implications. A phrase broad enough to swallow a life. She folded the infirmary letter once, then again, and set it beneath her plate. No reply at present. When she asked for the carriage after luncheon to visit St. Jude's accounts office, the coachman brought her a printed card in place of reins. Approved routes: Regent Street, Hanover Square, St. James's Church. Return. No deviations without written authorization. Her mother had arranged movement as one arranges furniture, useful, visible, and fixed. Ruby went nowhere. She stood in the front hall with gloves in her hand, while 2 housemaids polished the banister in careful arcs and avoided her eyes. Beyond the fanlight, London carried on with its indifferent velocity. Carts and hired cabs and men with newspapers tucked under their arms, all of it less ornate and more free than the house designed to display her prosperity. By the end of that first week under supervision, even kindness required strategy. She had tried to send a hamper of coal chits to the dock families her father had supported in severe winters. The steward returned the list unsigned. She had tried to authorize back wages to 2 warehouse clerks who had worked through fever in October. The household banker requested maternal counter-signature. She had tried to settle a seamstress invoice from her personal allowance and discovered that her allowance itself had been converted into vouchers redeemable only through the main office. Rank, she thought, was simply a prettier word for permission denied. In the second week of November, she discovered that the staff had been instructed to report her movements in writing. She found the report by accident, folded into the daily provisioning packet. Miss Bennet remained in library from 10 until 11:40, received no visitors, requested parish lists, appeared displeased. The script was neat and apologetic. At the bottom, in another hand, continue observations until marriage finalized. She took the page to her mother's sitting room without announcement, as she had done as a child when she still believed doors existed to be opened. Lenora sat before the fire with the family solicitor, Mr. Hargrove, a narrow man whose cuffs were immaculate and whose sympathy had always been theoretical. Ruby held out the paper. "Is surveillance now an article in my dowry?" Hargrove did not take it. Lenora did, glanced once and laid it beside her tea untouched. "Household reporting is standard when an estate is in transition," Lenora said. "You are not being watched. You are being protected from impropriety." "By being recorded. By being managed." The word landed with a clean edge. Managed. As if she were acreage in need of drainage. Ruby's voice did not rise. "I decline your definition." Lenora regarded her daughter with the mild impatience reserved for inefficient staff. "Your declinations are noted and set aside. We have obligations to creditors, to tenants, and to the Bennet name." "To whom does the Bennet name belong?" "To the line, not the individual." "Then why must the individual bear its obedience alone?" Lenora set down her cup. "Because the individual is female, unwed, and a legal vulnerability until her household is regularized." "Mr. Hargrove, kindly explain the timeline." Hargrove opened his folio. "If Miss Bennet cooperates, announcements may be circulated before month's end. Settlement terms can be finalized shortly thereafter." "Cooperates," Ruby repeated, tasting the word as if it were medicine ground too fine to spit out. Lenora smoothed one glove at the wrist. "Do not mistake this house for cruelty. It is structure. Without structure, capital decays. Without marriage, women are consumed by petitioners, flatterers, and men who speak of affection while calculating dowry yield." Ruby saw, suddenly and with cold clarity, that her mother believed herself merciful. That was the most dangerous part. She folded the surveillance report into a narrow strip and set it on the edge of the mantel. "Then we shall have no misunderstandings, Mother. I will not pretend gratitude for confinement." Lenora's expression did not change. "Gratitude is optional. Compliance is not." Ruby left before Hargrove could perform concern. That evening she ate alone in the small morning room because the formal dining table had been assigned to a trustee's supper she had not known was scheduled. Through the half-open service door she heard the household rhythm of preparation. Crystal unwrapped, candles trimmed, chairs counted and recounted. Her own place in the house had become a function of convenience. A daughter in the principal bedchamber, a signature in waiting. After dessert, she went to her father's old study, where the maps still hung slightly crooked, because he had always promised to straighten them later, and never remembered. The desk drawers had been rekeyed. She tried each one anyway, patient and methodical, and found only one left accessible. A shallow side compartment containing 3 sealing wafers, a blunt pencil, and a folded inventory of heirlooms marked restricted until marital transfer. She stood very still, one hand against the desk edge. Something harder than tears formed inside her. Not anger, which flared and spent itself, not despair, which asked for witnesses. This was a narrower thing, quiet and practical. A line being drawn in the dark. When she returned to her chamber, her maid was laying out ivory satins suitable for a public dinner, and the Bennett sapphires appropriate to an unmarried heiress under negotiation. The maid, Nora, kept her movements careful, professional, and fast. She was one of the few in the house who still met Ruby's gaze without calculation. "Mrs. Bennett says there will be guests on Thursday," Nora said. "A subscription dinner. You are to wear the East Indian lace." "Who is subscribed?" "Trustees, shipping men, 2 clergy, and certain advisers." Nora hesitated, then added in a lower tone, "The invitations call it an evening to celebrate continuity." Continuity, another elegant word for erasure. Ruby moved to the window. In the street below, lamplight struck the wet stones and split into hard yellow ribbons. A boy ran past with a basket of rolls under one arm. A woman in a threadbare shawl haggled with a coal seller. Across the way, a seamstress was still bent over her lamp, at an hour when respectable daughters were expected to be decorative and silent. "Does my mother celebrate me?" Ruby asked. "Or my transfer?" Nora's hands paused over the lace. "I do not know, miss." Ruby touched the cold glass with 2 fingers. "I think she knows exactly which." On Thursday afternoon, Lenora reviewed table placements with military precision, while Ruby stood beside the piano as if she were another floral arrangement requiring exact position. The place cards had been written in a hand Ruby recognized as her mother's. Trustees at center, clergy near the sideboard, advisers distributed where conversation could be guided. Ruby's seat was between Mr. Hargrove and an empty chair, marked Mr. E. Ashe. "Who is Mr. Ashe?" Ruby asked. Lenora did not look up. "A prudent adviser on matters your father neglected." "Then he is invited to advise me as well?" "He is invited to secure what remains of your future." Ruby traced the carved edge of the piano lid, feeling each groove beneath her fingertip. "My future appears heavily attended." Lenora placed the final card and straightened. "Attendance prevents error." Or dissent. Those are often the same thing in women of your age. The words were not spoken in heat. They arrived flat, administrative, final. At dusk, as candles were lit down the length of the dining room and carriages began to arrive in measured intervals, Ruby stood at the top of the staircase in East Indian lace that had belonged to her grandmother and sapphires she no longer felt entitled to wear. Below, footmen opened doors, announced names, and accepted hats from men who would discuss her life in terms of risk and yield. Her mother waited in the hall beneath the portrait of Ruby's father, posture immaculate, smile exact. "You will be gracious tonight," Lenora said without turning. Ruby descended 1 step, then another, her hand light on the banister polished by women paid too little to leave fingerprints. "I will be truthful," she said. Lenora's smile remained in place, but the muscles at her jaw tightened once before settling. "Truth, Ruby, is useful only when it is timed." The drawing room filled. Crystal caught firelight. Voices lowered into the careful register of money in motion. At the doorway, the butler announced another arrival, a plain name delivered with no title at all, and Ruby saw her mother's attention sharpen as if a final piece had entered a board already arranged. Mr. E. Ashe had come. Mr. E. Ashe had come, and he entered without any of the social signals that usually preceded a man invited to determine a woman's future. No crest marked his carriage. No title accompanied his name. His coat was black and serviceable rather than fashionable. The wool good, but unadorned, and his gloves looked as though they had been cleaned and worn again rather than replaced for display. He paused just inside the doorway while the butler shut out the cold behind him, and in that brief stillness Ruby saw the detail that did not match the rest. His eyes, grey, steady and exacting, like someone trained to measure weight before offering judgment. Lenora crossed to him with a courtesy she had not offered the bishop's nephew 10 minutes earlier. Mr. Ashe, we are pleased you accepted. You were specific about urgency, Mrs. Bennet, he said. His voice was low, controlled, and entirely unhurried. I considered that sufficient invitation. Ruby watched her mother incline her head by a degree that meant concession without admission. She knew that gesture. Lenora used it only when she was buying competence. Guests circled them in silks and black broadcloth, exchanging practiced pleasantries under chandeliers that had belonged to Ruby's grandmother, while footmen moved trays with the disciplined quiet of men instructed never to interrupt male decisions. It was all familiar enough to be wearying. A trustee from the docks spoke to Ruby about weather patterns as if she were 12. A rector thanked Lenora for preserving order in difficult circumstances. Mr. Hargrove accepted a glass of claret and informed a banker with performative sorrow that our dear Miss Bennet bears this transition with commendable composure. Composure, another word chosen for her. She stood where she had been placed near the mantel and received each conversational approach with faultless civility while feeling the invisible architecture of control at her back. Invitations issued in her name without consultation, funds withheld unless countersigned, routes pre-approved, outgoing letters inspected, and now this dinner labelled continuity so the city could watch her submit in polished light. She could identify every mechanism because she struck against each one daily. It was not a single cage. It was a series of small doors that opened only inward. At the first bell, the butler announced dinner. Lenora took the lead as if she were hosting a treaty, and the room sorted itself by precedence and strategy, not affection. Ruby moved with the line into the dining room where 12 places were laid in severe symmetry beneath her father's portrait. She had always disliked that painting because it softened him into gentleness he did not perform in life. Tonight she disliked it for a different reason. His painted eyes seemed turned toward the table where his daughter's legal future would be portioned with the fish course. Her place card had not moved. Mr. Hargrove sat at her right, smiling with professional concern. Mr. E. Ashe took the chair at her left. Up close she noticed his hands when he removed his gloves and set them beside his plate, calloused at the base of the fingers, faint ink along one knuckle, a thin, pale scar crossing the thumb. Not a drawing-room hand. A working hand. Yet when he unfolded his napkin and acknowledged the host, his manners were impeccable, spare, and unmistakably learned. Lenora opened the evening with a toast to stewardship, to responsible continuity, and to those willing to protect legacy from sentiment. Crystal chimed. Ruby drank water. Conversation began in measured channels. The clergy discussed poor relief in abstract figures. 2 shipping men exchanged assessments of Baltic rates. Hargrove recited procedural assurances in phrases so smooth they almost dissolved on contact. Each time Ruby turned toward a practical question, someone redirected her toward decorum. When she asked the rector whether the parish infirmary had received winter subscriptions, he glanced reflexively toward Lenora before answering. There have been temporary adjustments. Temporary. The infirmary had written 3 times in 10 days. Ruby turned to Hargrove. And are fever wards expected to observe timeline discipline while trustees deliberate? He smiled, patient as varnish. Miss Bennet, prudent sequencing prevents larger instability. To the sick, she said, instability is immediate. Hargrove lifted his brows as though she had made a social error instead of a factual statement. Your concern does you credit. At her left, Mr. Ashe had not entered the exchange. He ate little, listened closely, and watched the table with an attention that was neither nervous nor eager. Twice she caught him noticing details others ignored. A footman favouring one ankle, the steward replacing an untouched plate at Lenora's signal. The quick, apologetic glance Nora the maid cast from the service door when she saw Ruby's wine left unfilled while the men were poured. Each time his expression altered by the smallest amount and then settled again. By the second course, Lenora steered the room toward business. Mr. Ashe has agreed to advise us on maritime exposure until a permanent arrangement is ratified. An interim review only, Ashe said. A necessary one, Lenora replied. My late husband's appetite for speculative freight left us with avoidable risk. Ruby set down her fork. Her father had been reckless in many things, but he had not been ignorant in shipping. My father secured convoy clauses on every eastern route after the spring seizures. Lenora did not turn. Your father trusted personal assurances over institutional safeguards. Before Ruby could answer, one of the trustees leaned in with the indulgent tone men used when correcting women publicly while pretending not to. Miss Bennet, insurance is technical ground. I can read a policy, Ruby said. A silence opened long enough for discomfort to register. Then Ashe spoke for the first time in full to the table. Miss Bennet is correct regarding convoy clauses, he said. The weakness sits elsewhere. 3 contracts were indexed to projected tonnage without adjustment for dockside bottlenecks after August. That mismatch inflated premium burden by 11%. The shipping men turned to him sharply. Hargrove stilled with his glass halfway raised. Lenora smiled with contained satisfaction. Precisely the kind of prudence I wished represented this evening. One trustee frowned. 11%? On whose estimate? Mine, Ashe said. Derived from your own manifests, Mr. Collingwood. The error appears on pages 14 through 19 of the quarterly abstracts. Collingwood flushed under the candles. Those abstracts are not public. No, Ashe said. They are merely available to anyone authorized to protect this estate. Ruby looked at him then, fully, and a thought she had resisted all evening settled into place with unwelcome clarity. He was not an ornamental guest. He was already inside the machinery. Her mother had not hired a clerk. She had recruited an operator. Lenora turned to Ruby with a tone of gentle correction sharpened for audience. You see why emotion must sometimes yield to expertise. Ruby heard the room arrange itself around the sentence. She heard the collective relief of people who preferred order to justice as long as order kept their chairs beneath them. She saw the trustees' approval, the clergy's strategic quiet, Hargrove's small smile. At her left, Mr. Ashe remained still, unreadable. She could have swallowed the moment and preserved surface peace. She could have thanked them all for protecting her from her own judgment. She could have played the compliant heiress her mother had assembled course by course. Instead, she placed her napkin beside her plate and said, in a voice perfectly even and perfectly audible to every seat at the table, "Then we are to dine with fortune hunters tonight." Silver paused against china. Across from her, the bishop's nephew coughed into his sleeve. Collingwood stared at his claret as if it might offer instruction. Hargrove's composure slipped for 1 second before returning in legal form. Lenora set down her knife with careful precision. Miss Bennet. Ruby did not look away. If my dowry requires experts, let us at least name their profession honestly. The air held. No one moved except Ashe, who turned his head toward her by a fraction. His expression did not harden. It did not soften. It altered in a way she could not yet read, as if she had delivered information rather than insult. Lenora recovered first. She addressed the table, not her daughter. My apologies. Grief and inexperience can produce unfortunate candor. Ruby answered before anyone else could convert her into a cautionary anecdote. Candor is rarely unfortunate to those with nothing to hide. Hargrove touched his cuff, a gesture he used when preparing to intervene, but Ash spoke ahead of him. Fortune hunter is an imprecise category, he said, tone neutral. Some hunt fortune by marriage, some by negligence, some by accountancy. A few men gave strained, uncertain laughs, unsure whether permission had been offered. Lenora did not laugh. She turned to Ash. "And which category concerns you, Mr. Ash? Whichever exposes Miss Bennet to unlawful transfer." The words landed with quiet force because he delivered them as fact, not theatre. Ruby felt the lines strike through the room's comfortable assumptions and leave a narrow corridor of silence behind it. Lenora's smile returned, thinner than before. "Then we are fortunate to have your vigilance." "Fortune is variable," he said. "Records are better." No one resumed easy conversation after that. The final course arrived and departed through a table bound by etiquette and distrust. Ruby answered what was asked of her in complete sentences and did not volunteer. Twice she caught Nora in the service doorway, eyes wide with concern she could not express. Once she saw Hargrove lean toward Lenora and murmur, "This cannot continue publicly." Lenora replied without turning her head, "Then we shall continue privately." By the time coffee was served in the drawing room, the evening had split into small defensive clusters. Collingwood departed early. The rector pleaded an early sermon. The banker lingered only long enough to assure Lenora of discretion, which in his vocabulary meant loyalty to solvency over truth. Ash remained by the library doors with an untouched cup in hand, speaking briefly to no one unless addressed, watching everything. Ruby was reaching for her gloves when Lenora appeared at her elbow. "You will come to the library at 9 tomorrow," her mother said, voice low and perfectly composed. "Mr. Ash has accepted interim appointment as estate auditor. You will provide all correspondence, journals and memoranda in your possession." Ruby looked toward Ash. He met her gaze without evasion. Lenora continued, "You will cooperate fully." Ruby fastened the first glove, then the second. "As required. Do not perform tonight's spectacle again." Ruby lifted her chin by the smallest degree. "Then do not seat me at my own sale." Lenora's jaw tightened once and smoothed. 9 o'clock. She moved away before Ruby could answer, already receiving farewells as gracious hostess, already rewriting the evening into a narrative where discipline had prevailed. Across the room, Mr. Ash set down his untouched coffee and inclined his head to Ruby in formal acknowledgement. Neither apology nor challenge, then turned to collect a folio from Hargrove's hand. When he passed her, he said only, "Bring the parish ledgers as well." It was not a request. It was not an order. It sounded like preparation. Ruby stood in the centre of her mother's drawing room, gloves buttoned, back straight, and felt the house shift around a new axis she had not chosen. Tomorrow she would be audited in her own library by the man she had just called a hunter before witnesses. Tonight, for the first time in weeks, someone had said unlawful aloud at her mother's table and lived. She did not move until the last carriage rolled away and the front doors closed on the final exchange of polished gratitude. Then the drawing room resumed its ordinary proportions, no longer a stage for trustees and clergy, only her mother's furniture arranged for obedience. Ruby crossed to the hearth, lifted the cup she had set down untouched an hour earlier, and found the coffee cold enough to taste metallic. Nora came to collect trays and paused when she saw her still in lace and sapphires. "Shall I unpin your hair, miss?" "In a moment." Ruby set the cup back on the mantel. "Did Mr. Ash leave with Mr. Hargrove?" "No, miss. He is in the library still. The steward brought him the Eastern ledgers." Of course he was. The evening had ended for everyone else. For him, it had simply changed rooms. Ruby dismissed Nora, then stood alone in the corridor outside the library doors and watched candlelight move under the threshold. Her mother had issued tomorrow's command with perfect clarity. 9 o'clock, parish ledgers, full cooperation. The terms were administrative, but the effect was personal. She would sit in her father's library and open her papers, while a stranger measured what remained of her autonomy and called it fiduciary procedure. Inside, pages turned. Once she heard a chair scrape, then silence again. She did not enter. She went upstairs, removed the sapphires one by one, and laid them in a velvet tray that no longer felt like hers. Sleep came in narrow intervals. Each time she woke, she found herself listening for movement in the corridor, as though the house had acquired a new clock she had not yet learned to read. By morning, frost had printed white veins along the inside edge of her window glass. Ruby, dressed in dark wool, tied her own cuffs when Nora's hands were occupied at the fire, and took the bundle of parish ledgers from the side table, where she had left them in readiness. She had expected to walk directly to the library. Instead, she found the main corridor blocked by 2 footmen carrying coal scuttles, and turned through the service passage behind the breakfast room, where heat from the kitchens rose in brief, damp gusts and the air smelled of starch, yeast, and lamp oil. Halfway down the narrow hall, she stopped. A younger footman stood with his cap twisted between both hands, shoulders bent in the posture of someone waiting to be dismissed. She recognized him after a beat. Peter, recently transferred from the back stairs, careful to the point of fear. Opposite him stood Mr. Ashe, coat removed, shirt sleeves rolled once at the wrist, a stack of copied abstracts under one arm. The steward was there as well. Expression pinched. The index pages were filed with the outgoing manifests, the steward said. Mr. Hargrove asked who handled them. The boy did. Peter swallowed. Sir, I thought the red ribbon marked duplicates. It marked legal copies, the steward snapped. You thought wrong. Ashe did not raise his voice. He followed the ribbon system currently in use. The steward blinked. Mr. Ashe, with respect, the system has functioned for years. It has functioned for those who designed it. Ashe set the abstracts on the sideboard, then took the misfiled packet from Peter's hand and looked at the knot. This seal was notated in 2 scripts with conflicting symbols. Your senior clerk read one mark. The boy read the other. The fault is procedural. The steward shifted, clearly unwilling to lose ground before household staff. Mr. Hargrove expects accountability. He shall have it, Ashe said. Record this under my instruction and have the labelling rewritten before noon. Peter returns to regular duty. Peter stared at him, bewildered. The steward hesitated long enough for disapproval to show, then gave a short nod and left. Ruby had stepped back into the recess near the linen shelves when they entered the passage, but now Ashe turned as if he had known she was there from the first word. Miss Bennet, he said. She came forward with the ledgers in her arms, pulse unsteady for reasons she preferred not to name. Mr. Ashe, I appear to have interrupted discipline. Not discipline, correction. Peter stood frozen between them, cap still in both hands. Ruby looked at the boy. Report to the breakfast room. Mrs. Finch will need assistance with the urns. He fled with visible relief. When he was gone, she faced Ashe fully. In daylight, he looked less severe than he had under chandeliers, though nothing about him suggested ease. There was ink at the side of his finger where he had touched a wet notation. A pale scar crossed his thumb. His eyes remained what they had been last night, precise, unornamented, and unexpectedly attentive. You did not need to claim responsibility, she said. It was mine to claim. You could have let him carry it. Men do in this house. Then this house teaches badly. He picked up the abstracts and handed them to a passing clerk with two quiet instructions Ruby could not hear. Only when the clerk had gone did he look back at her. Accuracy protects the powerless first. The sentence landed with unnerving force because it belonged nowhere in Bennet House and yet explained half her life. She had spent weeks watching language used as a veil for confiscation, prudence for pressure, continuity for control, management for confinement. Accuracy was different. Accuracy named who paid. She shifted the weight of the ledgers against her hip. You speak as if you have been powerless yourself. His expression altered by a fraction, not closed, not open. I speak as if records decide who eats in winter. From the kitchen behind them came the clatter of pans and a cook's sharp call for more flour. The ordinary noise made the passage suddenly intimate, as though they stood outside the formal script of the household for one brief minute. Ruby inclined her head toward the library corridor. Shall we proceed to my examination, then? To the estates, he said. Yours has been ongoing for some time. It might have been insolence from another man. In him, it sounded like fact. They walked side by side toward the library, and she felt, against reason, the slightest easing in her chest. So small, she could deny it if asked. The library fire had been lit early, but the room remained cold at floor level where stone kept the night. Ruby set the parish ledgers on the central table and took her seat opposite Ash, while the clerk arranged ink, sand, and blank folios. At 9 precisely, Lenora entered with Mr. Hargrove, accepted their standing acknowledgements, and issued her terms in 12 clipped sentences. Complete review of shipping exposure, verification of parish disbursements, suspension of unauthorized subscriptions, and daily summaries delivered to her hand. She did not once look directly at Ruby while speaking. When she finished, Ash said, I require independent access to the household journals and doc abstracts. Lenora's smile remained fixed. Within reason. Within legal necessity, he replied. Hargrove made a note as if this had already been agreed. Lenora gave a single nod and withdrew, taking Hargrove with her, the door closing on perfume and authority in one motion. The first hour passed in near silence, pages turning, questions asked and answered without ornament. Ash worked quickly, but never carelessly. He checked figures against 3 ledgers when one would have satisfied a casual reviewer. He asked the clerk to read receipts aloud twice when signatures blurred at the edge. When Ruby offered context for a disputed parish expense, he listened without interruption, then marked her explanation in the margin in a hand as disciplined as his speech. At noon on the 3rd day she realized he had not once spoken to her, as if she were decorative. That week settled into a pattern no one had intended, yet everyone obeyed. Library audits from late morning until luncheon. Brief consultations at the accounts office attached to St. Jude's after 2. Evening review of tenant petitions in the small west parlour, because Lenora preferred not to have dock labourers and widows crossing the principal hall. The meetings were bureaucratic by design. Their effect was cumulative. In the library, contradictions gathered like small pins on a map. Ash translated a disputed freight clause from legal Latin into plain English with effortless precision, then later carried a crate of old manifests to the archive shelves himself when the porter failed to appear. He addressed Lenora with faultless deference and did not yield an inch on procedure. He asked clerks for dates and sums, never for gossip. Once, when Hargrove attempted to skip a page range as administratively redundant, Ash turned back 3 leaves and said, "Redundancy is where diversion hides." Hargrove did not attempt it again. 3 days passed before Ruby heard from St. Jude's infirmary. The letter arrived opened as always, but not intercepted. Winter funds still absent, medicine stocks reduced, 2 fever beds closed. She read it in the library while Ash reviewed shipping manifests, folded it, and placed it beside her elbow without comment. By habit, she expected the familiar sequence: request, delay, denial. Instead, Ash extended his hand. "May I see that?" She gave him the letter. His eyes moved once over the page. "This should have been paid from the discretionary parish reserve," he said. "It was deferred pending review." "By whom?" She held his gaze. "By structure." He set the letter atop a separate stack and wrote a short order on cream paper, sanded it, and sealed it with the interim auditor's stamp Lenora had authorized for him. "Take this to Mr. Bell in the front office," he told the clerk. "Immediate release for infirmary arrears from Reserve Account C. Copy to Mrs. Bennet and the rector." The clerk hesitated. "Mrs. Bennet has required countersignature for all charitable outflow." "Then she has required it without legal basis." Ash's tone did not sharpen. "Go." The clerk went. Ruby watched the door close and felt the old instinct to brace for retaliation. "You realize she will object." "She may object in writing." He returned to the manifests. "Writing can be answered." By the second week of November's end, their afternoons at St. Jude's had become the only hours in which Ruby could breathe without asking permission. The church steps were worn smooth at the centre from decades of boots and wet weather, and the parish office smelled of wool cloaks, ink, and damp stone. Petitioners came with caps in hand and numbers memorised, because dignity survived best when precise. A cooper with an injured wrist needing 2 weeks' relief. A laundress requesting coal vouchers after her husband's death at sea. A schoolmaster asking whether the roof repairs promised in summer would ever begin. Lenora never attended these sessions. Hargrove came once, found the benches crowded and the questions pointed, and did not return. Ash sat at the end of the narrow table, coat plain, cuffs clean, and listened as if each petitioner mattered equally to freight contracts worth £10,000. He asked for records, not stories, yet when records were incomplete, he still found a lawful bridge to decision. He did not perform generosity. He applied rules the way a mason lays level stone, line by line, weight by weight. On a Thursday evening, as dusk thickened early over the square, they reviewed tenant petitions in the west parlour while rain tapped against the panes in steady intervals. Ruby sorted letters by district. Ash cross-referenced rent rolls. Nora brought tea and withdrew without lingering. Midway through the stack, Ruby found a request from dock labourers at Kent Wharf. Emergency wages withheld after a storage fire in an adjacent shed had halted unloading. She looked up. "This one will be refused if it goes through ordinary channels." "It has already been delayed 6 days," Ash said, scanning the note. "Who authorised the hold?" "Assistant manager, on instruction from Central Accounts." "Central Accounts being your mother's office?" "Yes." He reached for the incident report and read in silence. "We will inspect the site at first light." Ruby blinked. "Kent is 2 hours in winter roads." "Then we leave early." He set the petition with the urgent stack. "If wages are withheld without cause, release follows on documented verification." She expected him to send a clerk. Instead, at dawn, he was waiting in the courtyard beside a closed carriage with 2 blankets and a metal dispatch box secured by strap and seal. Frost silvered the stones. Horses breathed white in the air. Ruby climbed in with her gloves still damp from fastening. Ash took the opposite seat and shut the door himself before the coachman set them in motion. The road south was rutted and hard. For the first mile they spoke only to exchange documents as the carriage swayed. Then a wheel struck a deep cut, the coach lurched, and the dispatch box slid toward the step. Ash caught it with one hand, braced against the wall with the other, and steadied both with practiced ease that did not belong to a drawing-room advisor. "You travel this route often?" Ruby asked. "Often enough to distrust polished reports?" "Another imprecise category." He glanced up, and for a moment something almost like humor touched his mouth. An accurate one. The expression was brief. It transformed him anyway from austere function to a man with warmth held in reserve. Then the mask returned, and he resumed reading the incident statement as though nothing had shifted. At Kent Wharf, smoke smell still clung to timber, though the flames were out. They inspected damaged storage, compared inventory tags, and found what the petition had implied. Wages withheld despite insured loss. Pressure applied to force workers into revised contracts, favourable only to management. Ash took statements from 2 foremen, copied serial numbers from charred crates, and dictated a provisional release order on the spot. Ruby signed as beneficiary representative when he passed her the pen. Her signature looked steadier than she felt. They returned to London after dark, carriage lamps cutting narrow gold tunnels through mist. At the townhouse gate, Ash handed her a folded copy of the release order. "Keep this with your personal papers," he said. "If Central Accounts contests payment, this record prevails." She tucked the paper into her satchel. "You assume I retain control of my papers?" "I assume you should." The butler opened the door before she could answer. Warm air and household light spilled over the step, carrying with them the familiar scent of beeswax and discipline. Ruby crossed the threshold with mud on her hem, smoke in her hair, and a release order in her hand that would put wages into men's pockets by morning. Behind her, Ash gave the dispatch box to the steward and spoke in that same low, exact voice that made refusal difficult without making a scene. No one in the hall remarked upon the hour. No one asked whether she had eaten. Lenora's door remained closed at the far end of the corridor, a line of light beneath it like a blade laid flat. Ruby climbed the staircase without waiting to be dismissed, the copy of the order warm from her glove, and understood with sudden clarity that proximity to Mr. Ash was not safety and not peace. It was something more hazardous to the house that managed her. Corroborated facts, entered in ink, impossible to smooth away. She reached her chamber and set the Kent release order on the writing desk, as if it were fragile glass, though the paper was ordinary and the seal already drying to a dull red. Nora knelt at the hearth coaxing flame from embers, and when she looked up, her face held the careful neutrality the household had taught every servant to wear. "Your hem is soaked through, miss." "It can be brushed in the morning." Ruby removed her gloves finger by finger. Smoke and wet wool clung to them. "Was there post while I was out?" Nora hesitated, then crossed to the dressing table and lifted a folded memorandum from beneath the hairbrush, where no one would see it at first glance. "This came from Central Accounts. Mr. Bell sent it up with the tea tray." Ruby broke the seal. The note was brief, written in the office hand that turned decisions into procedure. "Winter coal deliveries to Dock District Relief List, suspended pending review of beneficiary eligibility. No further disbursement without Mrs. Bennett's countersignature." She read it twice, each word flattening into the next. Suspended, pending, eligibility. Men who loaded ships in sleet had become a category to be verified at leisure. Nora watched her face in the mirror. "Shall I lay out supper?" "No, bring me the parish medicine ledger from my satchel." Nora obeyed at once. Ruby sat at the desk in her damp skirt and turned pages until she found the infirmary line items. Fever drafts, bandages, laudanum, tincture, coal allotment, all reduced, all marked deferred, on the dates her mother's office had tightened signatures. Near the bottom, among neat columns and rectified sums, 3 small payments appeared in another hand. Advance received from EA to be reconciled when reserve opens. She traced the initials with her fingertip. EA. There was only one man in this house those initials could name, and Hargrove was not a man to pay anyone before securing jurisdiction. "Who was injured in the Kent fire?" she asked without looking up. Nora answered after a beat. "A junior accounts clerk from the Riverside office, miss. Mr. Price. Smoke in the lungs, they said. He has a wife near Limehouse and 2 daughters." Ruby closed the ledger. "Did Mr. Ashe ask anyone to inform me?" "No, miss." Of course not. He had made the payments, entered them quietly, and moved on to the next figure. She opened her jewel cabinet and found what she expected. Necklace, earrings, tiara mounts on their velvet board, and one place empty where the full sapphire set should have rested. Lenora had already removed several pieces to the strong room for security while negotiations proceeded. Ruby stood very still for one breath, then reached to the back corner where a smaller tray held items considered secondary to display. A sapphire clasp lay there, oval, heavy, old enough that the gold work showed tiny hand-cut irregularities. Her grandmother had worn it at her throat in the portrait over the east stair. It was not the most valuable stone in the house, but it was hers by specific bequest, written in her grandmother's hand years before. Lenora learned to call affection inefficient. Nora turned from the wardrobe and saw it in Ruby's palm. "Miss, I require cash by morning." Nora's mouth tightened. "If Mrs. Bennet asks where it has gone—" "She will ask." Ruby wrapped the clasp in a handkerchief and tied a hard knot. "You will tell her I wore no jewels to breakfast." Nora came closer, lowering her voice. "I can send my cousin's husband to the broker. No one need know it was you." Ruby shook her head. "No, if there is risk, I carry it." She changed into a plain walking dress before dawn, pinned her hat with a brass pin instead of pearl, and left by the side door while milk carts still rattled over the stones. The porter looked startled to see her without carriage or maid, but she handed him a folded list for the kitchen and told him she was going to St. Jude's to verify petition dates. It was true, though not complete, and he stepped aside. London in early morning carried none of last night's polish. Tradesmen shouted at horses, women in aprons scrubbed steps, bakers opened shutters into the cold. Ruby walked quickly with the clasp warm in her glove, turned off the broad street before the church, and entered a broker's shop marked by no crest and little glass. Bells did not ring when she opened the door. The man behind the counter looked up, assessed her coat, her accent, her posture, and chose caution over insolence. "Madam." She set the wrapped clasp on the worn wood between them. "Immediate sale, not pledge." He unfolded the cloth, lifted the piece, tested the stone against the window light, then against his loop. "Family work," he said. "Old setting." "Yes. I can offer 160. It is worth 240. He looked at her again, this time with mild surprise. "You know your stones." "I know this one. 220, and you write a clean receipt without name." 200. He held her gaze. Final. Ruby thought of fever beds closed, of coal vouchers suspended, of a clerk coughing in a room above the river while account men discussed sequencing. Done. He counted notes and coin from a drawer, pushed them across, and wrote a pawn ticket anyway because systems produced paper whether one wanted it or not. She folded the receipt into her reticule, the ticket into her glove by habit, and walked back into the street with bare throat and enough money to move decisions faster than Mercy in Bennet House ever moved. At St. Jude's parish office, she paid the infirmary arrears first, in cash against signed acknowledgement, and required duplicate entries in both the medical ledger and the parish daybook. The rector's clerk blinked at the sum and at her insistence on precise notation. "Shall I mark this as donor confidential?" he asked. "Mark it as paid," she said. "If questioned, you may state that Miss Bennet settled a delayed account from personal effects." By noon she had crossed to the Riverside office where Mr. Bell kept the labour rolls and timber tallies. The room smelled of damp paper and tar. Mr. Bell rose when she entered, one hand braced against his desk. "Miss Bennet, I was not informed you would attend." "I did not seek permission." She set the second packet of notes before him. "Emergency wages for Kent labourers whose payments remain in dispute. Issue as temporary advances against verified hours. Record each signature." Bell stared at the money. Mrs. Bennet has forbidden many things." Ruby slid a copy of Ash's release order beside the notes. "Mr. Ash documented lawful release on site. If Central Accounts challenges this, direct them to me." Bell swallowed, then nodded once, practical instinct overruling fear. "Yes, miss." As she turned to leave, she noticed, through the half-open inner door, a narrow cot with a folded blanket and a basin. A young man lay propped on pillows, eyes closed, breath shallow and rough, cheeks hollowed by illness. A woman sat beside him, mending a cuff by poor light. She looked up when Ruby paused, uncertainty and pride battling in her expression. "Mr. Price?" Ruby asked quietly. The woman stood. "Yes, madam. He should be back at his desk by week's end. He says so even when he can barely sit up." Ruby stepped in, set the final coins on the stool by the bed, and met the woman's eyes. "For medicine and coal, not a loan." The woman's fingers tightened around her needle. "I do not know how to thank—" "You can keep him warm," Ruby said. "That is thanks enough." She left before gratitude could become spectacle. 3 mornings later, the consequences arrived with breakfast. Lenora entered the morning room before the coffee was poured, gloved, composed, carrying a folded cardstock packet and a narrow strip of paper between 2 fingers. Ruby recognized the strip at once, the broker's ticket, creased where she had pressed it in her glove. Lenora set it beside Ruby's plate. "You sold family sapphire through a dockside broker." Ruby buttered her toast and did not reach for the ticket. "I liquidated a personal bequest. You embarrassed this house. I paid its obligations." Lenora placed the card packet next to it. Engraved invitations, fresh from the printer, black script on cream. "Ruby Bennet requests the honour." A date had been fixed. No groom named yet, only the phrase in anticipation of formal settlement, broad enough to accommodate whichever alliance proved most useful. "You will attend these dinners," Lenora said, "and you will cease unauthorized disbursement. I have advanced the timetable because your judgment has become erratic." Ruby looked down at the printed date. 2 weeks. Her pulse struck once, hard at the base of her throat. "I did not consent." "Consent was obtained when you signed." "I signed an application under pressure." Lenora's expression did not alter. Pressure is how structure feels to those unused to responsibility. Ruby rose, folded the invitation in half, and set it back on the table. "Then we differ on responsibility." She went directly to the library because work was still the only language in the house that admitted facts. Ash was already there with 3 ledgers open, sleeves rolled, a fresh stack of petitions at his elbow. He looked up once when she entered, eyes moving briefly to her bare throat, to the place where sapphires had sat at the trustees' dinner, then back to the page. "Miss Bennet." "Mr. Ash." They worked for an hour in disciplined quiet. At some point she reached for the infirmary ledger while he reached for a shipping abstract, and the edge of a folio caught her cuff. Papers slid. One narrow strip fell to the floor between them. Ash bent first, picked it up, and held it a second too long before passing it back. The broker's ticket lay across his palm like a confession neither had requested. Ruby took it without explanation and tucked it into the ledger. A clerical remnant. His gaze remained on her face. Of course. Another page slipped from the folio. This one a receipt from St. Jude's with her signature and the notation paid from personal effects. He read only the first line before setting it down with deliberate care. "You paid them first," he said. The sentence was quiet, almost formal, and it landed heavier than any praise could have landed. Ruby adjusted the ledger edge until it aligned with the table seam. They were cold. He nodded once, then resumed marking figures, yet the distance in his address shifted by a degree she could measure and not name. When he asked for the tenant docket 10 minutes later, he said, "Miss Bennett, would you pass me the West District petitions?" And respect, not management, sat in each word. By evening, the house had learned of the sapphire, the invitations, the infirmary payments, and every whisper braided itself into a single narrative about an heiress in need of correction. Ruby finished the tenant's summaries, sealed them, and carried the packet herself toward Lenora's study, rather than trust another pair of hands. The corridor outside the study was lit by one wall sconce and the low bar of light beneath the door. As she approached, voices reached her through oak and panelling, clear enough to separate. Hargrove first, anxious and dry. "If she continues these unilateral acts, trustees may question governance." Lenora answered with bored precision. "Trustees question outcomes, not methods. We will regularize her." A chair scraped. Ruby stopped 2 steps from the doorframe, packet still in her hand. Hargrove again. "Then the marriage must be immediate." "Lenora, naturally, a husband is insurance. Affection is irrelevant." The words entered her body as sensation before meaning. A sudden, metallic taste at the back of her tongue. Fingers going numb around the packet string. Heartbeat striking too fast, and then harder, as if force could convert itself into steadiness. Another voice spoke. Lower, unmistakable. "The transfer must be lawful," Ash said. Silence followed, brief and sharp. Hargrove gave a short breath that might have been relief. "Then we are aligned." Ruby stared at the narrow line of light under the door until it blurred at the edges, then resolved again. Aligned, lawful transfer, husband as insurance. She felt the corridor tilt by an inch, though the floor did not move. Heat rose under her collar. Her hands stayed still against the paper. Inside, Lenora's tone returned to business. "Draft terms that bind disbursement to marital administration until stability is demonstrated." Hargrove murmured assent. A pen scratched. Ruby placed the tenant packets silently on the hall table, beside a vase of dead roses, turned and walked back down the corridor with measured steps. One hand pressed flat against her abdomen, as if holding herself together required physical pressure. She did not knock. She did not enter. She did not give them the spectacle of being overheard. Ruby did not stop until she reached the dark turn of the back staircase, where the voices from her mother's study dissolved into the ordinary sounds of the house. A maid shaking ash from a grate, distant china set too quickly on wood, the front clock counting out the quarter hour as if nothing had been decided in the next corridor. Her hand was still flat against her abdomen. When she lifted it, her palm held the crease of the packet string she had been gripping. She went to her chamber by the servants' passage so no one could call her back in the principal hall. Nora was folding linens at the foot of the bed and looked up at once. "Miss, you are pale." "Bring my travelling satchel." Ruby untied her cuffs with steady fingers. "The brown one, not the valise." Nora froze for one breath, then crossed to the wardrobe and drew out the satchel kept for brief parish visits. "Shall I prepare the carriage?" No carriage. Ruby moved to the writing desk and pulled a clean sheet toward her. No announcement. Nora set the bag on the chair and lowered her voice. "If Mrs. Bennet asks where you have gone—" "She will ask. You will say only that I left with one bag and my own hand on the latch." Ruby dipped her pen. Nothing more. The first line of the renunciation came slowly, the legal phrasing assembling itself from weeks of ledgers and statutes, and Ash's quiet corrections in margins she had pretended not to memorize. "I, Ruby Ann Bennet, of lawful age and sound mind, refuse all transfer of personal trust holdings contingent upon marital administration or coerced settlement." She paused, listening to the scratch of pen on paper, and kept writing until the document no longer sounded like refusal alone, but like a record meant to survive argument. Nora placed garments into the satchel without waiting to be instructed. 2 plain dresses, a wool shawl, underlinen, ledger pencil, gloves thick enough for river wind. At the last she held up the East Indian lace wrapper and raised her brows in question. Ruby shook her head. Nora put it back. When the letter was complete, Ruby sanded it, folded it once, and wrote her name across the seam before sealing it with plain wax. She did not use the Bennet crest. From the small lacquer tray she took the ring Lenora had insisted she wear after the application was filed, a narrow band with a modest diamond meant to signal inevitability rather than affection. She set it beside the seal and looked at the pale indentation it had left at the base of her finger. Not grief, not panic, a cleaner sensation than either. Decision. She crossed to her father's old desk in the adjoining sitting room, where the current household marriage ledger had been left open after dinner planning. Names and dates laid out in neat columns like freight routes. Ruby placed the sealed renunciation directly over the page, marked Anticipated Settlement, and laid the ring on top so it could not be missed, or quietly misplaced. She added one line on a calling card and tucked it beneath the wax. "Filed by my own hand. No proxy." By the first week of December, London nights had taken on a hard mineral cold that climbed through stone and silk alike, and the windows answered each breath with a faint fog of white. Ruby drew on her gloves, lifted the satchel herself, and moved for the door. Nora stepped into her path, eyes bright and fierce. "Miss Bennet," Ruby met her gaze. "You have been kind in an unkind house." Nora swallowed and nodded once. "Then go quickly." Ruby left by the side stair and entered the corridor outside Lenora's study. Light still burned beneath the door. She could hear no words now, only the rhythm of 2 men moving papers and her mother's chair creaking once as she shifted. She did not knock. She bent, set the tenant packet she had carried there earlier squarely against the threshold where the crack of light touched it, and straightened. Then she walked away, each step measured and unhurried, as if this too were an ordinary household errand. At the service entrance, the night porter started when he saw her cloak and bag. "Miss Bennet, it is late. Shall I send someone with you?" "No." She handed him a folded note addressed to Mrs. Bennet in her own script. "Deliver this to the morning tray only." He looked from the note to her face and understood enough not to question her again. He opened the door. The air struck sharp and wet. Ruby pulled her collar closer and turned toward the river roads where rents were lower, offices narrower, and men like Elias Ash kept rooms that did not require pedigree to enter. She had the address from an audit memorandum copied weeks earlier. 3 lines at the bottom of a page she had read for figures and remembered for caution. Ash E. Temporary Office and Lodgings, Cormorant Row. The streets thinned as she walked south. Shop shutters closed one by one. Cartwheels hissed over damp stone. Lamps guttered in pockets where wind tunneled between warehouses. Twice she passed gentlemen who looked at her plain cloak and single bag and saw only another woman on necessary business. Once a boy offered to carry the satchel for a coin. She refused and kept moving. Cormorant Row stood behind the old customs lane, a narrow terrace of brick darkened by soot and river mist. Number 12 had a brass plate with no title, only the surname Ash, cut in small letters polished by frequent touch. Ruby climbed the 3 steps, set down her bag, and knocked. The door opened almost at once. Elias Ash stood in shirt sleeves, waistcoat unbuttoned at the throat, ink on his fingers and a candle in one hand. He did not look surprised. He looked as if he had expected news and did not yet know its form. His eyes went first to her face, then to the bag at her feet. "Miss Bennet," he said, "it is near midnight." "I know the hour." Ruby kept her voice even. "May I enter, Mr. Ash?" He stepped back without ceremony. "Yes." The room was modest and spare. 1 table under maps pinned with coloured threads, 2 straight-backed chairs, iron grate fire banked low, shelves of account books without decorative bindings. A dispatch box sat open beside a stack of sealed packets, each marked with dates and initials. No portrait, no silver, no pretense, just work. Ruby set her satchel by the chair but remained standing. "I came to terminate every arrangement in which my name has been used. I have left written renunciation at Bennet House. I surrender claim to any settlement contingent on marriage, title, or maternal administration. If the trustees prefer to freeze the trust indefinitely, let them. I will not be transferred." He closed the door and set the candle down. "Sit. I prefer to stand." "As you wish." His tone did not change. "Tell me the rest." She looked at him fully then, at the man who had said records are better, who had paid infirmary bills in initials, who had spoken the word lawful inside her mother's study while Hargrove said aligned. The iron taste returned at the back of her tongue. "I heard you tonight," she said. Outside her door. "My mother said her husband is insurance. Mr. Hargrove said the marriage must be immediate. You said the transfer must be lawful, and he answered that you were aligned. If you came to Bennet House to protect capital, you have done your work. I release you from it." Silence held for several seconds, broken only by the small crack of coal settling in the grate. He went to the table, lifted 2 sealed document packets and carried them to her without haste. "Read the outer endorsements." Ruby took them. The first bore a court filing notation from Chancery with a date 3 weeks earlier. The second carried a private trust seal she did not recognize, heavy wax pressed with a crest of ash branches around a tower. Beneath both, in clear hand, petition to restrain fiduciary diversion, Bennet Trust. Provisional findings, independent audit. She looked up. "These are not Hargrove's papers." "No." He met her gaze, expression grave and level. "They are mine." He set 1 finger on the unfamiliar crest. "My name is Alistair Ashcombe, Marquis of Vane. The Ashcombe Iron and Shipping Trusts predate the Bennet line by 2 centuries. I entered your house to stop your mother from converting your trust into her private holding through a coerced marriage." The words did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like a lock turning. Quiet. Final. Ruby stood absolutely still, document weight in both hands, and felt the past month reorder itself with ruthless clarity. Lenora's precision when he arrived without title. Hargrove's caution around him. Access granted to records no interim clerk should have touched. Legal Latin worn as easily as work scars. authority that never announced rank because it did not need to. Not merely a prudent advisor, a power figure concealed in plain cloth. She set the packets on the table with care. You let me accuse you. Yes. You let me call you a hunter at my own table. I did. His voice lowered by a fraction. A man who enters under false station has no claim to immediate trust. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps apology sharpened by pride. He offered neither. Only fact. Why not tell me on the first day, she asked, because a warning without proof would have placed you in greater danger, and me outside the records. He nodded toward the chancery filing. Your mother needed to proceed far enough to document intent. Hargrove needed to draft terms in writing. I needed lawful grounds to stop transfer before signature execution. We reached that threshold tonight. Ruby touched the edge of the first packet. At the cost of my believing you complicit. At that cost. The room held the bluntness of it. No soothing language, no theatrical plea. Just a ledger-balance acknowledgement of what had been spent. She moved to the chair at last and sat, elbows on her knees, fingers laced to keep from shaking. I left my ring on the marriage ledger. Good. The answer came without triumph. That ring was evidentiary theatre, not contract. I also signed renunciation of any claim contingent on marriage. That may be amended if you choose. It may also stand. He took the papers, opened one packet and slid out a copy written on thick cream stock. You are beneficiary in your own right under your father's original trust and your grandmother's supplemental codicil. Lenora's authority was supervisory, not proprietary. The proposed settlement would have blurred that distinction beyond recovery. Ruby read the codicil heading and saw her grandmother's name in formal script, witnessed and sealed years before. A line in the margin, easily missed without patient eyes, specified that control passed fully to Ruby upon proof of coercive administration by guardian or parent. Proof, not sentiment. The old woman had built an escape hatch in legal stone. What else do these contain? Ruby asked. Inventory, diversion schedules, withheld disbursement logs, draft settlement clauses, and statements from Kent Wharf regarding wage pressure. He folded his hands behind his back. Enough for court restraint and trustee removal. Enough to return your accounts to your own signature. She let out a breath she had been holding since the corridor outside Lenora's study. Then I have walked out of Bennett House on the night before you planned to dismantle my mother's authority. You walked out when your dignity required it, he said. Timing can serve more than one truth. The candle flame shifted as wind pressed at the window frame. Ruby looked around the plain room once more at maps and seals and work done without witness, and understood that the man before her had hidden power, not to toy with her, but to reach the one place Lenora trusted least and used most, the record. She straightened in the chair, voice steady again. What is required of me now, my lord? His expression altered slightly at the title. Not pleasure, not discomfort, only recognition that the room had changed with the name. Tonight, rest, he said. Tomorrow you sign the affidavit in your own hand, and we submit these at first call. Ruby nodded once. On the table between them lay her future in stacked paper and drying wax, no longer arranged by her mother's gloves, no longer negotiated through men who called captivity structure. Outside, the river moved unseen through the dark, bearing cargo, rumour and cold, while in a rented room on Cormorant Row, the terms of her life had finally been spoken without disguise. Ruby read until the candle burned low and the ash in the grate collapsed inward, then set down the final page of the affidavit bundle and lifted her eyes to Alistair Ashcombe, as if seeing him and the room at once for the first time. The maps on his wall were marked not for conquest, but for accountability. Warehouse codes, parish routes, insurance lanes, each line ending in initials and dates. She had spent weeks being told that men protected women by withholding information. Here, every protection was written down and placed in her hand. "Where do I sign?" she asked. He drew a smaller packet from the dispatch box and laid it open. "At first light, before a commissioner for oaths. Tonight, you do not return to Bennet House." The statement carried no drama, only decision. He crossed to the door and called for Mrs. Greaves, the widowed landlady who kept the rooms and took no interest in pedigree. When she appeared in shawl and cap, he said, "Miss Bennet will take the upper chamber. She is to be disturbed by no one unless she asks." Mrs. Greaves looked from his face to Ruby's travel satchel and gave one short nod that held neither curiosity nor pity. Ruby slept in linen that smelled faintly of starch and lavender. At dawn she woke to bells from the river church and the sound of cartwheels on wet stone. By 8 o'clock she sat in a narrow chamber near Chancery Lane. The affidavit spread before her, while a commissioner in black coat read each clause in patient, exact phrases. Alistair stood beside the mantel, hands clasped behind his back, speaking only when the commissioner requested a document. "Exhibit A," the clerk said. Ruby placed her sealed renunciation on the table. "Exhibit B." The printed invitation naming her anticipated settlement. "Exhibit C." The engagement ring wrapped in plain paper, with her calling card beneath. "Filed by my own hand. No proxy." "Exhibit D." The broker's ticket for the sapphire clasp, paired with St. Jude's receipt, marked paid from personal effects. "Exhibit E." The surveillance report. Miss Bennet remained in library from 10 until 11:40, appeared displeased. The commissioner's brows rose once at that line, then settled. "And this was household practice?" "Documented household practice," Alistair said, supported by staff statements and office instructions. Ruby signed each page in a hand so steady it surprised her. The commissioner sealed the packet and slid it across to his clerk. "Filed before noon. Interim restraint remains in force. Notice to trustees and current fiduciary officers will issue today." 3 days later, when the trustees' dinner convened in Bennet House under the invitations Lenora had ordered, the city arrived expecting a formal settlement and a dutiful daughter restored to script. Ruby entered through the principal doors in dark blue silk without sapphires, her gloves plain, her posture unhurried. Footman announced her name with a fraction too much force, as if the house itself had not yet adjusted to its own new acoustics. The drawing-room stilled by degrees. Collingwood of the manifests paused with his glass halfway raised. The bishop's nephew looked quickly toward Lenora and then away. Mr. Hargrove touched his cuff and failed to hide the tremor in his fingers. Nora stood in the service doorway with a silver tray and met Ruby's gaze directly, relief and pride passing between them in one brief, disciplined look. Lenora approached first, smile controlled, jewels severe at her throat. "Ruby, you chose to absent yourself without permission." Ruby removed her gloves and handed them to a footman. "Permission is no longer the relevant instrument." Lenora's eyes sharpened. "You do not understand the consequences of theatrical gestures." "On the contrary." Ruby inclined her head toward the dining room doors. "I understand them precisely." The butler announced the final arrivals before Lenora could answer. "The Marquess of Vane." Conversation stopped cleanly, like a curtain dropped by a practiced hand. Alistair crossed the threshold in formal evening coat, with the Ashcombe signet at his breast, and the calm of a man who did not need the room's approval to occupy it. Not merely Mr. E. Ash, not merely an interim adviser. The title moved through the guests in a ripple of recalculation that touched every face. He acknowledged no one until he reached Ruby, then bowed with full courtesy. Miss Bennet. My lord. He turned to the assembled trustees. Gentlemen, we proceed to business. No one objected. Even Lenora did not, though the muscles at her jaw held hard. At table, the places had been reset. Ruby was seated at the head where her father had once sat. Lenora to her right, by old precedence, Alistair to her left by legal necessity. Hargrove had been moved down 3 seats without explanation. Soup was served and removed untouched by several men before Alistair unfolded a sealed order and placed it beside Ruby's plate. With Miss Bennet's consent, he said, voice carrying to every end of the table, I submit the Chancery restraint and independent audit findings regarding Bennet Trust Administration. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The clerk from court stood behind him and read the order in dry, devastating language. Diversion of discretionary funds, coercive marital structuring, unauthorized surveillance of beneficiary communications, suppression of charitable disbursements, contrary to trust terms, attempted transfer of control through contingent settlement clauses. Each phrase landed like a measured strike, not brutal, final. Hargrove interrupted once. These allegations require context. The clerk continued reading. Lenora set down her spoon with immaculate care. This is procedural overreach. Ruby answered before Alistair could speak. It is procedure at last. The dining room held that line in silence. Collingwood cleared his throat. If the court has restrained fiduciary authority, who executes immediate obligations? Ruby opened the ledger copy before her. I do, effective this evening. The rector, seated halfway down, leaned forward. Then St. Jude's infirmary accounts. Released in full this morning, Ruby said. Back arrears and winter reserves. Receipts entered and countersigned. Mr. Bell from Riverside Accounts, invited as witness rather than ornament, produced a folded sheet. Kent Wharf emergency wages were distributed to all listed labourers. Signatures verified. Mr. Price has returned to partial duty with medical leave protected. At the far end, one trustee asked in a low voice, And the coal suspensions? Lifted, Ruby said. District vouchers reinstated under direct beneficiary authority. Lenora turned to Hargrove, and for the first time Ruby saw uncertainty break through her mother's polished restraint. You assured me supervisory discretion was sufficient. Hargrove looked at his plate. I advised caution. Alistair slid a final paper across the table to Lenora. Removal order, Mrs. Bennet. Effective on service, completed 1 hour before dinner. Lenora read the first lines and set the paper down. She did not plead. She did not rage. Her cruelty had always worn the face of boredom. Now, boredom failed her. You have humiliated your own house, she said to Ruby. Ruby folded her napkin once and placed it beside her plate. I have ended its fraud. No one came to Lenora's defense. The collective whisper of society, so loud when a woman was compliant, had gone silent when documents outnumbered gossip. By dessert, 2 trustees had requested copies of the revised governance terms. By coffee, Hargrove had excused himself and did not return. The loaded look Nora had worn for weeks resolved when she passed behind Ruby's chair and murmured, almost soundless, Your note reached the tray. Peter, the footman once blamed for misfiled ribbons, served wine with a steadier hand. By night's end he had been reassigned to records where precision mattered more than fear. When the guests withdrew, the same dining room was reset for the charitable board Lenora had once treated as decorative. The candles burned lower, the china was simpler, and the agenda lay in Ruby's own script. Infirmary allocations, dock school roof repairs, winter coal logistics, audit publication schedule. She chaired from the head seat, while the rector, Mr. Bell, 2 parish women and 3 trustees took minutes and voted in order. No one asked her to wait for countersignature. No one opened her letters first. The final motion passed just before midnight. Emergency fund release protocols in plain language, posted publicly at St. Jude's and the Riverside office by morning. Ruby signed the order, sanded it, and handed it to Bell for dispatch. "No delays," she said. "None," he replied. When the board dispersed, only she and Alistair remained in the long room where she had once called him a hunter before men who thought her future negotiable. The fire had burned to red coals. Outside, carriage wheels faded one by one into the London dark. He stood across from her, not at her side, giving distance the dignity of choice. "I owe you no defence you did not ask for," he said. "I also owe you truth, if you still wish it. I will stand beside you in truth." Ruby looked at him for a long moment, seeing all of it held together now. The calloused hand catching a sliding dispatch box, the legal Latin spoken like breath, the quiet order that protected a frightened footman, the initials in a medicine ledger, the title withheld until disclosure served justice rather than pride. The world had called her managed, decorative, transferable. He had asked for her signature and waited for her answer. "Then stand," she said. He came to her side unhurried, and together they looked down at the open board ledger where her name, written in her own hand at the top of the page, no longer waited for permission.